Idolatry and other religions. Why is this so important? Because the first two commandments of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself a carved image or likeness, an idol, right? So really the first two commandments of the Ten Commandments are about idolatry and other religions. This is hugely important. I don't think it's any coincidence that these are the first two. These are serious things to God. And now, if you talk to any Jew, they actually order their Ten Commandments a little bit differently, okay? Because right before these two, it actually says that I am the Lord your God, okay? And so if you talk to any Orthodox Jew, they will say the first commandment of the Ten Commandments is actually I am the Lord your God, right? Which is interesting because that doesn't sound like a commandment to us. But it is a statement of God's being, right? I am. Yahweh, the divine name, means I am. And so for them, it's so important. Remember I said, what is the most important verse to Muslims? Or sorry, the most important, there's the 5 pillars of Islam. The most important to them is this statement. There's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, right? So it's kind of an affirmation of the oneness of the being of Allah. For Jews, you know what the most important verse is? The Shema, right? The Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The I am the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, right? That kind of affirmation of God's oneness, of his being, of his I am, precedes the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God. And here, they also say the I am statement is the most important. Now, how did they get 10 commandments, though, if they have this quote-unquote extra one at the beginning? What they do is they combine these two into the second commandment, okay? Nevertheless, this is a hugely important thing because this is what kicks off the 10 commandments, right? Idolatry, what do we do about other religions? How does God feel about them? This is the subject of the beginning of the 10 commandments. Of course, theology always comes out of occasions and it comes out of historical circumstances. So when Moses came down the mountain with this, do you remember what happened? He came down with the tablets and he saw the golden calf, right? They made a golden calf and they were worshiping it. Like, can you imagine? Moses, he had this intimate encounter with God. God personally wrote with his finger the 10 commandments, which he's never done with any other part of the Bible. All the other parts of the Bible, God uses human agents and uses them to be the instruments of writing. This is the only time that God personally uses his finger and writes the 10 commandments. Moses comes down the mountain, and here he is fresh from this encounter with God. And what does he see? He sees the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. How do you think Moses might have felt at that point, right? And especially knowing the first two commandments are these, right? So he was so angry. You know what Moses did? He actually smashed the tablets, right? That's what the Bible says. And so he had to actually rewrite the tablets. I mean, if I were Moses, I don't know. I don't know if I'd take it out on the tablets. I think I'd rather have smashed the golden calf, right? But nevertheless, that's what happened in that situation. And in the New Testament, this is not just an Old Testament thing. New Testament sanctions Paul multiple times says, flee from idolatry, right? 1 John 5:21 says, little children, keep yourself from idols, right? Acts 19 says, abstain from things polluted by idols. So idolatry is all throughout the Bible. This is something which is taken seriously. Now, what about the link between idolatry and images, okay? Somebody may say, what about the bronze serpents, right? Or the cherubim on the ark. The ark of the covenant, remember, I showed you a picture. There's 2 cherubim on top, 2 angels with their wings touching, right? That's certainly an image, right? So does that go against the 10 commandments? Or what about the bronze serpent? Do you guys remember what the point of the bronze serpent was? What was the bronze serpent made for?
To heal the people when they looked at it.
Okay, to heal the people when they looked at it. If you remember, on the Exodus journey, people were being bitten by poisonous snakes. And so God says to Moses, make a bronze serpent, which is kind of, I mean, I don't know, when I think about it, it strikes me the wrong way after, the golden calf, then they He has to make a bronze serpent. But the bronze serpent was for a purpose, right? He makes the bronze serpent, puts on a pole, and lifts it up. And anybody who looks on the bronze serpent would be healed from the poisonous snake bites. Now, of course, this is another pre-gospel, right? The bronze serpent lifted high on a pole represents Jesus, lifted high on the cross. Anyone who looks upon him will be healed. So this is a pre-Christ, pre-shadowing or prefiguring Christ. But the thing about the bronze serpent is this, right? Even though it was God-sanctioned, look in 2 Kings 18. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places and broke the pillars, cut down the Asherah, right? So this is a good king, which is unusual among that time, right? There were a lot of bad kings. And he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. This I find remarkable. Even something which was intended for good can become an idol, right? Even something which God himself sanctioned. People have a tendency to just run away with it and make it idolatry, right? Now, when I look at the Catholic Church and I look at all the images of saints they have, right? And it sure looks like worship to me sometimes. And they're praying to the saints and they're bowing down before the saints. And and I talk to any Catholic theologian or priest, they will always protest. They say, no, it's not. It's not idolatry, it's not worship, it's veneration. I'm like, okay, fine, veneration. But the thing is, what was intended for good, people always have a tendency to run away with it and turn it into idolatry. We have idolatrous hearts. That's just the way we are formed, not the way we are formed, but the way we are have fallen, right? And the way that it's our tendency when left unchecked. Even people worship the bronze serpent. I'm like, even though saints are, even if the original intention is not to be worshipped, people do worship them. And I'll tell you, I was a missionary in Mexico for a while, and people sure worshiped some of those saints, okay? So don't tell me that that's not worship going on, right? Even if the original intention wasn't meant to be so. People just have this tendency, right? Now, notice, even though the bronze serpent or the cherubim on the ark were okay, there never is images of humans which are allowed in the Bible, okay? So I think that is especially to vitiate against this tendency which, even if certain other images are allowed, human images are certainly not allowed, right? Now, I don't want to bash too much on Catholics because I think there is a point to Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, we are supposed to look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. Yet, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, right? I think sometimes Protestants run to the opposite extreme, excessive individualism, right? Now, I don't think we should be worshiping the saints, but I think we also need to remember the heroes of the faith that have come before us, right? Hebrews 11 is the great hall of faith, right? I think we need to remember Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David and all these other people. I don't think that's worshiping them, but I think it's good to remember them in their example. I teach a missions history class, same thing. We need to remember William Carey, Adoniram Judson, David Livingston, and all these other great people who have come before us, right? I don't think that's idolatry, but we need to guard our hearts against it because hero worship is such a tendency, right? We do that with celebrities, we do that with sports heroes, we do that with whatever, right? We can even do that with pastors and theologians, like as if they do no wrong, right? But I think we need to be careful about that. So, one thing is, when I think about the other monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam, though I do believe Christianity is the right way because I think we need Jesus. At the same time, I think there are things we can learn from other religions that perhaps they do better sometimes. That's not to say that they are a right religion, but I think there are aspects of other religions that perhaps they do better than us, right? And I think Jews and Muslims are much better at being iconoclastic than Christians. You go to any Jewish synagogue, okay, iconoclastic just means they don't have images, right? They don't have icons. They're against icons. Judaism and Islam are totally against icons. They're totally against images. The most you will see is maybe a pattern of flowers or something, right? You go to any Muslim mosque, the only, actually the greatest decoration they have is Arabic script. There will be Arabic script all over the walls, right? And part of me thinks, wow, that's what a great example. Like they believe so much in their Quran that is the thing they use to decorate their mosques, right? The word, right? And what about us? Do we do that? You know, in Judaism, they don't have any images of people ever, right? Or animals, or it's just, you know, maybe the Star of David at most, right? But I think Jews and Muslims are much better at being iconoclastic than Christians. And the other thing Jews and Muslims do better, I think, is prayer. I mean, I think maybe not the way they pray, but the frequency and the fervor of their prayer, man, I think it puts Christians to shame. And I think those are two things that we can definitely learn from them. They are, after all, our sister religions. I don't think they're right, but I think there's a lot of resonance we can have with them, right? There's a lot of shared similarities. Okay, now this is a typical painting of the Trinity from, well, this is Renaissance Europe, but I see this kind of thing, you know, I lived in Europe for 5 years, and I saw this stuff all over Europe. Now, one of the reasons that art was so prevalent in Europe in the Middle Ages especially is because of lack of literacy, right? With the Protestant Reformation came literacy, came the printing of the Bible, came the distribution of it all over the place. Before that, because of illiteracy, the best way to teach was via visual images. Now let me ask you, what do you think about this particular visual image representing the Trinity? Do you like it? Do you think it's good? Do you think there's a problem with it?
I think like even understanding Trinity as like God doesn't necessarily, I guess if we're using this picture as like understanding Trinity, God necessarily doesn't even have a body.
Okay.
And so in my mind at least, it glorifies Jesus in that, in the sense of his picture is pretty accurate, I would say, but also with the Spirit just being represented as a dove, but also as God represented as an actual human being. Maybe a twist our idea of what the Trinity is, even maybe taking the Holy Spirit and making it a lesser part of the Trinity, or something that is not as equal as maybe the Father.
Okay.
Because it's represented as just a dove in this picture.
Okay. Now, granted, the Scripture does represent the Holy Spirit as a dove, right? But I take your point as well. Perhaps it almost looks like if we represent the Holy Spirit as a dove, it almost makes us not identify it with it as much, right? Because if we're created in God's image, well, we certainly don't look like doves, do we, right? So that almost sort of estranges the Holy Spirit from us. But at least the Holy Spirit came down as a dove, so you know, they're trying to be more literal to Scripture. Jesus Christ, of course, did come human form, but I also take your point that God the Father is described as having no body and is invisible, and no one has ever seen him, right? So to represent it in this way goes totally against Scripture, right? I can understand maybe someone trying to paint Jesus because Jesus actually did physically come in visible earthly form. God the Father never did. To try to paint him as visible, earthly, human, seems to go against what Scripture says. So I think there's a qualitative difference between painting the Son versus painting the Father. All right? And yeah, not only does it make him look like he's got a body, but you know, it gives him a certain age, it gives him a certain race, it gives him a certain, like, you know, and it makes me think, well, have we limited God because of these images, right? You know, Colossians 1:15 says, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So I'm kind of more okay with image with Jesus, but the invisible God, right, the Father, I think I'm less okay with that. John 1:18 says, no one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, Jesus has made him known, right? So I don't know. I think this, there may be some problems with this, okay? Now, when we talk about idolatry, really we're talking about religious adultery. What do I mean by that? How is adultery similar to idolatry? The word to know in Hebrew is the word yada. And the word to know can be a euphemism for sex, okay? But it could also be another word for worship, right? Yada, you'll hear this in like, if you're, one of my favorite shows ever is Seinfeld, right? Seinfeld is a hilarious comedy if you've seen that. Jews always go yada, 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 right? That means I know, right? So yada means, but this word to know is the same word as in the sentence, Adam knew Eve. In other words, Adam had intimate relations with Eve. It's also the same word in Adam and Eve knew good and evil. Same word. And it's also the same word as in, you shall know that I am the Lord your God. The same word, right? So to know, for a husband and wife to know one another, it's the same word as humans and God knowing one another, right? So I don't think there's a coincidence that husband and wife is an analogy for Christ and the church, right? There's that kind of intimacy and love there. But the thing is, monotheism, and thus monotheism and monogamy have a similarity, a parallel, if you will, right? Monotheism, to stay loyal to one God. Monogamy, to stay loyal to one spouse. Infidelity is rampant, not only in the secular world, but even in the Christian world. We have a tendency to stray. Again, that's after the fall, that was the way that we tend to go, the way we tend to run. And we do that with the people who we love. We also do that with God. Monotheism is very difficult. It's a very difficult concept to stay loyal to one God, right? And again, I talked about the tendency to even have celebrities or hero worship, or Paul says, do not say I follow Cephas, I follow Apollos, I follow Paul, right? So just as we have a tendency towards polygamy, we have a tendency, or being unfaithful, we have a tendency towards polygamy when it comes to worshiping God as well, right? Idolatry is religious adultery. Now, the story of Hosea and Gomer you might be familiar with, right? Hosea is the prophet of God. He chases after his wife Gomer. Even though she's a prostitute, even after they're married, she still runs off to other men, right? This is an analogy for God's faithfulness towards us. Though we are constantly unfaithful, though we are like Gomer and constantly running after others, God continues to pursue us relentlessly. And he keeps on buying us back over and over and over again, no matter how many times we stray, right? So again, this human love is similar to the love between God and humans, right? Okay, but really idolatry can be putting anything over God. Matthew 6:25 says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon, right? Mammon could sometimes translate as money, but I think mammon could be anything which is put over God. So it's not just other religions. I think, because a lot of people may say, today do we worship other gods, right? Well, maybe not, but we certainly still have idolatry. And let's say you can turn towards Satan or demons. You can turn towards power, pleasure, race, ancestors, the state or politics, and money. All of these things are tendencies, are things that we can put over God, that we can. So you might even think that you can worship God along with these things. We'll talk about some of these things in the future, but certainly I think that if God is not your first priority, one of the greatest tendencies, I think, among Christian circles, evangelical Christian circles, maybe you guys aren't into these other things, right? But how about relationships? Focus on the family, I think, is great, right? But perhaps can we have an over-focus on the family? Can we have an over-focus on romantic relationships? Jesus says, if you do not hate father, mother, brother, sister, or spouse, you're not worthy of me. Now, I don't think Jesus literally means hate them. But I think what Jesus means, are you putting them over me? Even romantic relationships, are you putting that over me? And if that's the case, even that thing which is intended for good can become idolatrous, just like the bronze serpent, right? So I think we need to watch that tendency. Okay, idolatry could even be yourself. Psalm 115, not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. However, their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk. And they do not make a sound with their throat. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. I think that last line is especially important. Those who make them become like them. You become the idols that you worship. Okay? I think that is a truth. And I remember when I was in seminary, I had a discussion with some other classmates, and we said, well, what is the greatest sin of all, right? And some of us said pride. Some of us said, no, it's not pride, it's idolatry. And we thought about it a little bit more, and we said, you know what, these are probably flip sides of the same coin. Pride is an idolatry of self, isn't it? Right? But also, when you worship something, you become like it. So if you do have an idolatry, that also becomes, you're creating yourself into the image of that which you are worshiping, right? If you've read Dante's Divine Comedy, especially the Inferno, there are different levels of hell, and in the center is the four greatest sinners. It's Satan, and then three humans, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas. And according to Dante, the greatest of all sins is betrayal. Okay? But I actually don't think so. I think it's pride or idolatry. And I think whatever you worship, you become like it. And you yourself could be the object of idolatry if you make yourself over God, or if you think you know better than God. Ryan?
When you say that you become like what you worship, could you give an example of that?
Sure. I think, let's say power, right? I mean, if power is the thing that you crave most, right, and you chase after it all the time, then you become powerful, and then you become the one in charge of everything, and you even set yourself up against God, right? I think money has a similar kind of thing, right? Because money leads to power, right? Because this whole world wants money, and so those who control the money control the power, right? But I think even if you're worshiping literally another idol, right? You start to fashion your characteristics after those, right? Those things that that other idol embodies. And then you could think that it is those principles which are the most important. Remember, when in that lecture, when I talked about Sky Jatani and those 5 postures of life and God, one of them was life over God. Life over God is what the Pharisees often did. They may have said, oh yeah, we worship God, but really they were worshiping legalism. And by using legalism, they actually controlled God as their puppet. They used God, the principles of the Bible, to control others. And I think they ended up, I mean, it really wasn't about devotion to God. At the end of the day, it was about looking good in front of others and being able to lord it over others. So I think if we are not worshiping God, and I think this is why God comes in humility, right? Because I think it's only a God that comes in humility that sets a good example for us, right? if God were a megalomaniac, I think his followers would become so too. And I think it's really good to keep that in mind. So, okay, let's move on here. Let's talk about warfare. Why is warfare applicable to idolatry? I think because often warfare is the way that God dealt with idolatry, in the Old Testament at least, right? Now remember, God made a covenant with Noah. The Noahic covenant was, that rainbow in the sky is a symbol that I will never wipe out humanity again. So if God doesn't want to wipe out humanity, why did he sanction sometimes what looked like genocide, right? I think that was really difficult, right? In Joshua, especially. Joshua goes to the promised land, just totality of destruction. God says, wipe out every man, woman, child, even their cattle, their sheep, everything, right? Is this like Christian jihad? Is this reminiscent of the Crusades? I think the Crusades looked at the Old Testament and took that example and thought that that's the way to go. Is this genocide? Does this bother us, right? Remember I talked about, in a previous lecture, I talked about David, and I said that David was not allowed to build the temple because there was too much blood on his hands. And even though God said, yes, I'm allowing you to create warfare on people, at the end of the day, that wasn't the ideal. Peace was the ideal. Shalom, which is where Solomon gets his name from. Solomon is a form of shalom. Right? Peace is the best way. Warfare is merely concession, right? And I think for the Old Testament, lest we say, hey, we need to be like the Old Testament. Let us go to war against Muslims, or let's just wipe out. I mean, if there's anything that we can say, oh yeah, it seems like we're just copying the Bible, right? I don't know. I think we need to be careful because just war theory, I think today doesn't say we need to wipe out everybody in their totality, right? And also, you know what? We are not a theocracy, and we are not ancient Israel. As much as we sometimes like to think that we are not ancient Israel. And therefore, I don't think we can do exactly what ancient Israel did, okay? Augustine and Augustine, in fact, these are two of the greatest theologians in the history of the church, and they said, you know what just war theory is? They said, first of all, the reason for going to war needs to be just. It cannot be solely for recapturing things taken or punishing people who have done wrong, okay? Another principle they said, just war theory is, it includes that innocent life must be in imminent danger and intervention must be to protect life, okay? Thirdly, just war conduct should be directed towards enemy combatants only, and not towards non-combatants caught in circumstances they did not create. And fourth, just war conduct should be, this is very important, should be governed by the principle of minimal force. I don't know that necessarily the way we conduct warfare follows all those rules, okay? Just war, Christian warfare, right? So I'm not saying we all need to be pacifists, but I'm also not saying that we could take the example of Joshua to sanction any warfare that we do today. Now, you remember in 1 Samuel 5, there was a story of Dagon. The Philistines, and by the way, that's where we get the word Palestine today, right? That Palestine is the land of the Philistines. The Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. They brought it before Dagon and their god. And do you remember what happened in the story? 1 Samuel 5, Dagon, they wake up the next morning and find the statue's fallen down on its face. Then they prop it back up. The next day they come back and the statue not only has fallen back on its face, but is broken in pieces, right? So here is an example of God doing battle against another god, okay, against a false god. Now this is interesting because I think that we need to think about this concept of power encounter. What is power encounter? That's when God faces off against other powers, okay? And this is a part of mission. This has been a part of missions. You'll see this in the story of St. Patrick as he confronts the Irish Druids. You see this in the story of Boniface as he confronts Jupiter's oak in converting the Germans. And you see this especially in Elijah and the prophets of Baal, right? Now, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, this is a bit of a hilarious story, I think. Who says there's no humor in the Bible, right? Elijah, you remember the story. He says to the prophets of Baal, let's have a contest. Your God against my God, right? This is power encounter. Baal, he says to the prophets of Baal, ask your God to send down fire to burn up this altar. And I'll do the same with mine. Let's see whose God is real. And of course, the Baal prophets chant, and they're like cutting themselves and like, dancing around this altar, and nothing happens. And Elijah's sitting back, and he's still like mocking them, right? He's like, so what happened to your God, huh? Is he asleep? Is he on the toilet, right? What's going on? This is a pretty funny scenario. And I'm like thinking, Elijah, you better be pretty sure that your God's going to come through, right? Otherwise, you're toast, right? And of course, his God does come through, the true God. Now, when you look at God versus Dagon, or God versus Baal, those are false gods because those gods can do nothing, right? It's kind of like Psalm 115, which I just talked about, quoted. They have eyes but do not see, ears but do not hear, mouths but cannot speak. However, are idols always like that, right? Now, what about Moses and the Egyptian magicians? You remember Moses was facing off against them, and they took their staff and they turned it into snakes, right? And then Moses took his staff and turned it into a bigger snake, and it ate their staffs, right? So, okay, what's going on here? Unlike the prophets of Baal, which is false and has no power, what about these Egyptian magicians? Did they have power? What they did, was that actually real? Was that illusion? What was going on? And then a final example is Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac. Remember, I am legion. Jesus casts out the demons. They go into the pigs. They drown themselves. I think this is real demonic activity. This is not just a false idol that has eyes but cannot see or ears that cannot hear, right? So, so when we're talking about idolatry and other gods, we have to decide, well, is it like Baal, who's just false and can't do anything? Or is it like the demoniac, where this is real evil stuff? This is really powerful stuff, but Jesus has to conquer it. Or is it something like the Egyptian magicians, which we're not sure where that is? Is that just illusion, and that's fake? Or is that really demoniac stuff, right? You always have to ask, is this false gods or demonic? And whenever you encounter another religion, that question needs to come to mind, right? Because if you just go towards another religion and think that, oh, this is just a false god, but it actually is demonic, you could be in a world of trouble if you're not prepared for it, right? But at the same time, if it is false, then there's also, you have to know how to approach that as well, right? So, okay. One of the most famous encounters is Paul on the Areopagus. The Areopagus is another name for Mars Hill, right? Ares is the Greek word for the Roman god Mars, the god of war. So Paul was on the Areopagus on Mars Hill. And now the interesting thing about this in Acts 17, it's the first time that Paul spoke to a group of pagans. Up until this point, he's always ministered to Jews. But then there's a turning point here. He starts ministering to Gentiles, right? So he's speaking to a completely pagan crowd. There's no Jews in this crowd. And I think this is really instructive for us to look at the example of the greatest missionary in the Bible and see what he does when confronting a completely pagan crowd. Now you remember what happens. He says, "Men of Athens, I see you are very religious. You have many gods, and you even have this altar to an unknown God. Now what you call as unknown, let me now proclaim him to you." Right? Now, this is a bit surprising, because we would think that Paul would just say, "Away with all your gods. Let me tell you about the true God." But he says, "No, I see you have this unknown God. Let me explain that to you, and I'm going to tell you that that's actually the Christian God." Does that make you uncomfortable? Is that the way that we usually approach missions today when confronting other religions? Or do we try to just sweep it all away? Well, Paul's strategy is this. First, he engages their religion. So he says, "Hey, look, I see you have many gods. I see you have an altar to an unknown God." So he knows what their religion is. So if you do missions, I think you need to know what the other group's religion is. Okay, you know, it's far more common that you encounter on the mission field other religions rather than atheists. I think atheists are actually a very small part of the world today. Almost everyone in this world worships something, someone, right? Some God. So you have to know how to encounter other religions. First, so you have to know their religion. You need to study their religion. If you're going to do missions somewhere, you better gather all the information you can about their religion and know what they believe, okay? Don't go in unequipped. Secondly, he engages their culture. Not only does he say, I know your religion, I see your altar to an unknown God. He says, as your own poets have said. He starts quoting their poets. He knows their culture. He knows their literature. He knows, you know, if it were today, he would know the music they listen to and the TV shows that they watch, right? He knows what is up with their culture. And notice, up until this point, he does not even mention Jesus Christ. And then finally he says, let me tell you about this man, Jesus Christ, right? This is the last thing in his strategy. Sometimes we have the tendency to go abroad on the mission field, and we want to do number 3 first, right? We want to go in and go firing away with the Bible. Start hitting them over the head with Bible verses. Start talking about Jesus first thing. Look at the strategy of the greatest missionary in the Bible. He doesn't do that. He says, I know you. I know your religion. I know your culture. He ingratiates himself with them. This is called contextualization, right? And once they start to trust him, once they say, hey, he knows us, once they say he understands us, then he can point to Jesus, okay? But not until that point. And I think to just fire away, do a drive-by on them with the Bible does not help, right? Again, how many times do we just stand on the street corner and preach and want to hand out tracts, right? Without actually understanding people's culture, building relationship with people, building trust with people. So Don Richardson is an author who wrote this book, Eternity in Their Hearts. And he gets it from this quote from Ecclesiastes 3, he has set eternity in the hearts of men. Now, what is this? He calls this the principle of redemptive analogy. The fact that God has placed a spark of himself inside every human being on earth. Now, even if they do not know him, even if they do not have the Bible, every human being is made by God. And therefore, don't you think that God would sort of pre-program himself into everybody in some way, right? If somebody makes a computer, don't you think that the programmer would like sort of pre-programs the computer in a certain way? I think God does that. And there's a spark, there's an eternity spark in the hearts of all men, okay? This is the principle of redemptive analogy. This is what Paul did on the Areopagus. I see you have an unknown God. And rather than let's get rid of this unknown God, he says, let me tell you that this unknown God can actually be the Christian God. That you were worshiping the Christian God all along, you just didn't know it. Again, does this make us uncomfortable? Does this, we want to sweep away all idols as false. But perhaps there is a spark of eternity inside each one of us, right? This is called general revelation. Now, he also talks about, Don Richardson talks about the Melchizedek factor. Remember I talked about Melchizedek? He was this random dude in the middle of Israel, right? From Jerusalem or Salem. And he and Abraham went to him and said, how is it that you know the true God, right? How do you know this? And Melchizedek, perhaps had this principle of redemptive analogy. He didn't know Yahweh by name, but he knew this God called El Elyon, God Most High. And then Abraham figured that he and Melchizedek were actually worshiping the same God, even though Melchizedek called him by a different name, right? Whoa, this is remarkable, right? Rather than Abraham denigrating Melchizedek's faith as pagan, because obviously Melchizedek could not be a recipient of direct special revelation. He didn't have scriptures, or he didn't have someone preaching to him, right? But rather, Abraham calls Melchizedek a friend of God. And he pays him a tithe, right? So somehow he recognizes that this random person in the middle of nowhere, is actually worshiping the same God as him, but called by a different name, right? Now, on the other hand, there's also the Sodom factor. While it's true God places eternity in the hearts of all men, this redemptive analogy, but Sodom is the sin factor. We are all products of the fall. We are after the fall. And so even though we may worship even though people may have a spark of God inside each one of them, they may actually twist that because of sin and start worshiping something similar to God, but not quite. I would say that Islam is a perfect example of this, right? It's twisted. They have that spark. Or a lot of, and I'll show you other cultures that have that spark, right? But it's been twisted, right? The Athenians, they worship this unknown God. It's been twisted because of the fallenness of sin. And so what you have to do is grab onto that spark, but set them in the right direction, right? Rather than sweep away all their old religions and say everything is false, let me replace it all. If you do that, people are not going to listen to you. They're going to say this is a foreign imported religion. But if you can work with what's already there, it's much more effective, as Paul has shown, right? Okay. Now, let me give you examples. Let's start with South America, the Inca world, right? The Incas are this great South American civilization. There was Pachacuti was the greatest Inca emperor. And this was before the arrival of the conquistadors, okay? And he called a council to replace Inti. Inti was the sun god. And he said, we need to not worship the sun. He said, Inti worship, let's replace him with the worship of Viracocha, which was kind of one of their supreme gods, okay? Or maybe the supreme god. And he's saying, Inti is merely a kinsman, a fellow created entity, okay? Follow this logic now. This is a pagan, Pachacuti, Inca emperor, before the arrival of Europeans and the Spaniards and the conquistadors and bringing Christianity. And he says we need to not worship the sun. We need to worship Viracocha, this supreme god. Why? Well, he reasons. Inti cannot be universal if, while giving light to some, he withholds it from others. Inti cannot be perfect if he cannot remain at ease, resting. Inti cannot be all-powerful when the smallest cloud may cover him. Whereas Viracocha is ancient, remote, supreme, and uncreated. Nor does he need the gross satisfaction of a consort. He manifests himself as a trinity when he wishes, otherwise only heavenly warriors and archangels surround his loneliness. He created all peoples by his word, as well as all huacas, or spirits. He ordains man's years and nourishes him. He is indeed the very principle of life, for he warms the folk through his created son, Punchal. He is a bringer of peace and an orderer. He is in his own being blessed and has pity on man's wretchedness. He alone judges and absolves them and enables them to combat their evil tendencies. And you look at this, doesn't this kind of blow you away a little bit, right? Like this pagan South American Inca emperor who comes up with this. There's so many similarities to Christianity. That's the Melchizedek factor. Yet there are a few twisted, not quite right things, like the sun being created, and that's the Sodom factor. Yes, Henry?
I had a question about, I guess, this incorporating, Jesus into the other pagan religions.
Yes.
So, like, how weighty is it, or how literally are we taking it that they have to call Jesus Savior and Son? For instance, if we gave it like a different name, or like we used their name for, I think like that's where someone might be.
Right.
Because you didn't call him Jesus, even though it's the exact same thing.
Right. Sure. If you use a different name for Jesus, like can you call Jesus Punchal, right?
Yeah.
Like, right. That could be problematic because all language has baggage associated with it, right? And you bring that in with it. I will answer your question as the lecture goes along, okay? Hopefully this will. All right, but thanks. That's a great question. There definitely is the fear of syncretism if you use their words for God and Jesus and theology, right? But the danger is if you don't use their words, they just think it's a foreign word and they don't accept it, okay? So in a way, you have to recognize and honor their culture in order for them to accept Christ. But do it in a way that doesn't taint it, right? Okay. Now, I got the chance to go visit Machu Picchu in Peru, right? This was a lot of people were wondering what Machu Picchu was. It was one of the only Inca retreat sites or cities that was not discovered by the conquistadors. So it was discovered in 1911 by a guy named Hiram Bingham, who's a professor of archaeology at Yale. And he uncovered this, and so it's become so famous because it's in such pristine condition. And it's just dramatic. It's on top of this mountain, and it's overlooking the Urubamba River and the Inca Sacred Valley. And up there is that other mountain that's called Huayna Picchu. And but it's pretty spectacular, right? People were wondering what this was for, and they finally figured out in the last couple of years this was a royal retreat site for the emperor. So it's kind of like the Camp David, right, for the Inca emperor. Okay. So now the thing is, when I went up to Machu Picchu, it's really hard to get there, all right? Because the only way to get there is, first of all, you got to fly to the Spanish capital of Lima. Lima is down by the coast, okay? And then from there, you got to fly up into the Inca capital of Cusco. Now, you probably know the word Cusco. You've seen Emperor's New Groove, right? But Cusco, was that emperor in the cartoon, was named after the Inca capital city of Cusco. So you got to fly from Lima up to Cusco. Now, Cusco is high in the Andes Mountains, 10,000 feet above sea level, right? The Incas all lived up there. And I was reading through my guidebook, and they said, be careful, because you're going to get altitude sickness. The Quechua word for altitude sickness is soroche. So they said, you're going to get soroche. I didn't take this seriously, right? I was like, I only have a few days up there. I totally want to just avail myself of the opportunity. So the first day I was there, I went hiking up in the mountains, right? Bad move, right? Because there you are, you got altitude sickness, and I felt like I wanted to puke, right? I had a headache, like nausea, like shivers. I mean, it was terrible. And so they said, well, the way to cure altitude sickness, soroche, is to drink coca tea, right? So they take the coca leaves and they boil it and you drink it as a tea. Well, yeah, that helped, but then I found out that coca is the stuff that they make cocaine out of, right? So, well, it's not cocaine. Let me just be very clear about that. This is also on the recording. So, cocaine is you have to take tons of the coca leaf and heavily chemically process it and whatever. But coca leaf has a mild stimulant similar to caffeine. Okay, so that's what South Americans chew to work in the fields or just get their day started. So, but you drink this coca tea and yeah, that kind of helps the altitude sickness a bit, okay? Now, when you're up there, I also am a huge fan of trying the local food, right? Now, the Spanish ate very different stuff from the Incas. And the Incas, do you know what their culinary specialty is? Anyone know? Anyone been there to Peru? It's roasted guinea pig, okay? They call this cuy, okay? Now, and I'm usually very adventurous, and I'll try almost anything, right? But this was absolutely disgusting, right? I have to say. Now, are you guys ready for this? Do you want to see a picture of this? Okay. This is what it looked like, right? So, okay, the cuy, I mean, you know what a guinea pig looks like in real life, right? It's like looks like a big hamster. It's like really cute and stuff, right? And then after it's roasted, it just looks like a giant rat after a nuclear holocaust, right? So, now I ordered this thing. I have to eat it, right? Even though it looked disgusting. So I take my knife and fork, I'm about to dig into it. And then the locals in the restaurant come up to me and say, no, con sus manos, right? So with your hands, right? So I had to grab the head, grab the legs, and bring it. So I ate about half of it, I think, and it was just, but it was pretty gross, and I think that was enough for me. Plus I had altitude sickness, right? Like nausea, like felt like I wanted to throw up, and I was trying to eat this thing. So bad combination. And so I eventually was like cuenta por favor, right? Check please. Like that was about the most I could tolerate. But this was, yes, I had this. I don't know if I'd have it again. My rule of thumb is I'll try anything at least once, but I think that was my once. Okay, so now here's the thing. We're talking about contextualization, right? The Incas were conquered by the Spanish conquistadors. And the conquistadors took the city of Cusco, tore down a lot of the buildings, used those building blocks to construct Spanish-style buildings. And in the Plaza de Armas, which is the center of Cusco, they have a great Spanish cathedral, which is pretty typical. Now, what did they do? They built this cathedral. They tried to convert all the Incas to Christianity. And then I walked in, and there was a painting of the Last Supper. Now, what did the conquistadors do in order to convert the Incas? Well, this is what the painting of the Last Supper looked like. Now, notice what's in the center there, right? There is a guinea pig. And now, here's the question. Did Jesus actually eat a guinea pig? Of course not, right? Then the question is this appropriate? Can you use this to contextualize to the Incas in a way that they understand, even if literally Jesus never ate a guinea pig, right? Is this a good, proper contextualization, right? So this is what missiologists have to think about. This is what we have to struggle with. Systematic theologians would say, of course not. We're just going to take everything literally, right? But I think literal is not always a good hermeneutic. Contextualization is about understanding the culture, understanding what hits people's hearts and minds the best, even if it may not be literal, right? This is why I sometimes think like dynamic equivalent translations of the Bible, like the NIV, is actually better than literal translations like the NASB. Literal can sometimes be so wooden, but it may not actually mean anything to us or mean less to us than a contextually relevant type of translation, okay? And so perhaps this is a contextually relevant type of translation for the Incas. Now let's move from South America to Asia, okay? Particularly China. Well, actually, before we get to China, let's talk about India. Robert de Nobili was a Jesuit Catholic missionary to India. And you know what he did when he was ministering to the Indians? He dressed up like a Hindu Brahmin monk. Now the Jesuits were like, I know, whenever I teach missions history, I like to think of them as the sort of the Navy SEALs of the Catholic Corps, right? So they were like the most intense ones, right? They were the ones who go in and they'll just go all out for missions. And one of the innovative things they did was contextualization, radical contextualization. Now, they got a lot of criticism for this because some of the others, the Franciscans and the Dominicans and other Catholic orders and other missionaries would say, you cannot dress like a Hindu Brahmin monk. I mean, what kind of message are you sending to the Hindus? Because if you're trying to tell them you're a Christian, but you look just like them, like you're confusing things. This is syncretism, right? Are you telling them that Christianity is just like Hinduism, right? But they refused. The Jesuits said, no, we need to dress like this. We need to be as contextual as possible. This is the equivalent of going to Peru and saying that Jesus ate a guinea pig, right? Like, this is the equivalent of Paul saying, I understand your religion, I understand your culture, and let me tell you that you've been worshiping Jesus all along. It's just you call him an unknown God, right? So this may make a lot of systematic theologians very uncomfortable. But this seems to be the biblical witness, right? It's like Abraham saying to Melchizedek, I call my God Yahweh, you call him El Elyon, but I think it's the same God, right? There's a resonance here. Somehow we discovered the same thing, despite the fact that we're from different places, because God spoke to both of us, all right? Now, moving to China, Matteo Ricci was the equivalent of Robert de Nobili in India, except he was in China. He was a Jesuit. And he dressed like a Buddhist monk or a Confucian scholar to minister to the Chinese, right? And this was, again, hugely controversial. A lot of people said Matteo Ricci is selling out. He doesn't look like a Christian. But the thing is, what does a Christian look like? Does a Christian look like a Westerner, right? And a lot of missionaries thought that's what a Christian looks like. And they confused Western culture with Christianity. So these guys were way ahead of their time in being contextual, right? But the question is, did they cross the line? They moved from contextualization to syncretism. I think this is hugely important. All right. Now I want to talk about something called the term controversy. Do you know that when you translate the Bible into another language, do you know what's the hardest word to translate in the Bible? It's God. God is the hardest word in the Bible to translate. So you have James Legge, who is from Scotland, and he goes over to China, and he's trying to translate the Bible into Chinese. And then you have William Boone, an American missionary, and he goes over to China, and he's trying to translate the Bible into Chinese. Now they both do a pretty good job of this, but Boone and Legge cannot agree on the translation of God, right? Well, why? James Legge says this: we need to use the word 上帝. This is a Chinese indigenous word. That means the most high supreme God. Now, the thing is, Chinese already worshipped Shangdi. In fact, the Chinese had a whole pantheon of gods, but Shangdi was the supreme God. All right? So it's kind of like going to Greece and saying, oh, you got, Ares and Artemis and Apollo and Athena and whatever, but Zeus, right? Zeus is the most high God. Would you go to Greece and say that Zeus is the same as the Christian God? Most people would say no. So that's why James Legge got a lot of flack for using Shangdi. They're like, this is a Chinese God. Like, how can you say that's the same as the Christian God? Well, William Boone used this other word called Shen. And, but the problem is, Shen implies like ancestral spirits. It implies a whole bunch of supernatural kind of thing. So James Legge said, you cannot use Shen. That is the wrong word to use because you're getting into ancestor worship here, and you're totally muddling the thing, right? And James Legge, I mean, the way he used Shangdi was kind of like the way that Pachacuti used Viracocha, right? It's the most supreme of the Inca gods. So, can that be equivalent to the Christian God? Well, what about Shen? And so these guys duked it out, and they actually both published their Bibles, but with different words for God. So there was the British version, which had Shangdi as God, and the American version, which had Shen as God. Okay, and then, but then we also need to not forget Matteo Ricci. He used this word Tianzhu. Tianzhu means something like the heavenly Lord, right? That's kind of the translation of it, right? The problem with this is it almost seems to imply like a human Lord, right? It's just a little higher, right? Or it doesn't quite have a sort of deity implication to it, right? Now, interesting about this was the term controversy because they were all in argument about which is the correct term for God. You know what none of them used? None of them used the word Yehovah. Yehovah is the transliteration of Yahweh. And none of them wanted to use this word because they said it implies a foreign god. The Chinese have never heard of the word Yehovah. If you use this, they will not think that it's something indigenous to them. And they will always be against it. So all three of these guys, Ricci, Legge, Boone, though they disagreed on what word to use for God, they all agreed it cannot be a foreign imported word. It must be something which is used within their context. Okay, so again, food for thought, right? Is this good or not? Let's hit a little closer to home here. Actually, before we get there, if you ever go to Beijing, one of the three greatest sights to see in the city of Beijing is one is the Great Wall, the second is the Forbidden City, and the third is the Temple of Heaven. The Temple of Heaven is the temple devoted to Shangdi. So when James Legge was a professor, he was a professor. He was a professor of Chinese literature at Oxford University. But when he was a missionary to Beijing, he ascended the steps to the Temple of Heaven, and he sang the Christian doxology to Shangdi to be a witness to the Chinese. Right? It's a very interesting strategy. So again, is this correct or not? Now, hitting a little closer to home, let's talk about Islam. Something you know a little better, perhaps. The question is, can we use the word Allah for God when you're witnessing to a Muslim? What do you guys think? Appropriate or not? Jennifer?
I think that you can, only you have to kind of redefine who Allah is, I guess, or just adjust.
Okay. All right. So she says you can, but you need to redefine or adjust the definition of Allah. Anyone else? Would you feel comfortable using the word Allah when you're preaching to a Muslim about God? Yeah. Kylie?
I would just for the fact that I feel like when you're preaching God, you need to understand the distinction between, because I feel like Allah is just such a part of their culture. It's become such a normative thing that I feel like I would want the distinction of God as to be higher instead of apart. So I think I would have in understanding the concept of who God is, I think use it in an explanation. But as far as using that as the Christian biblical understanding of God, I think I would come up with them with a new word
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because, Allah has so much baggage, right? I mean, when a Muslim hears the word Allah, all sorts of things flood into their mind, all sorts of images, all sorts of associations and characteristics. That's a lot of things to get rid of, right? But at the same time, if you use the word God in opposition to Allah, you're kind of saying that there's no similarities between the two. I don't know, That's a big question. Is the Christian God the same as the Muslim God? Do Muslims just misunderstand the true God, or are they worshiping another God altogether, right? And I think what Jennifer was getting at is, let's just redefine Allah. That's implying Muslims are worshiping the right God, but just in a wrong way. Kylie, on the other hand, says, well, we need to use God as in opposition to Allah. And it almost seems like it's saying, no, it's like a different God altogether, right? And so this is a question that missiologists struggle with a lot, right? Is it a different God or is it the same God, right? Is it just a misunderstanding of the same God, or is this a completely different one? Do you get rid of it, or do you work with what's already there, right? Well, here's the thing. Let's take a look at this. If you talk about Allah, well, if you talk to a Muslim, they believe that Allah is one. Christians go, great, like that. Allah is omnipotent. We go, great, like that, right? Allah is merciful and forgiving. Fantastic. However, love is hardly ever mentioned in the Quran. We believe that God's greatest characteristic is love. At this point, Allah doesn't start to sound like the Christian God anymore. There's no gospel in the Quran either, right? There's just prophetic warnings and books of laws. So if you talk about Allah, perhaps it implies that this is a different God altogether, right? There's no Trinity, certainly not. In fact, you know what Muslims believe? Because Muhammad had an incorrect understanding of Christianity, and a lot of it had to do with the Catholic Church because of Mary veneration. So Muhammad, when he encountered the Catholic Church, he was like, oh, I see their Trinity is Father, Mother, and Son, right? And so Muhammad wrote in the Quran, Muhammad wrote, God has no consort and no offspring. He was writing this because he was trying to fight against what he thought was the Trinity, which was Father, Mother, and Son, which is that's not the Trinity, right? But nevertheless, the oneness of God, as I talked about for Jews, hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. And Muslims say, there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, right? So at this point, Allah doesn't seem like God so much, right? So question is, do you just correct their misunderstandings but continue with what coheres with Christianity? Or do you wipe out all of this and replace it, right? Now here's a question. Oh, and also God is not Father, right? So there's no concept of God as Allah as Father. Now the question is, can you use Isa for Jesus? Isa is the Arabic word for Jesus. What do you guys think about this? Kylie?
I would have to know, if it's the word for Jesus, but what are the implications alongside that word?
Okay.
When you say Jesus, what comes to mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because if it's already a positive kind of, not a positive, but a
Uh-huh.
accurate depiction of who Jesus is, then I would see no problem.
Okay.
It's
Sure. So again, language has baggage, and you have to know, Kyle is exactly right, what are the implications of Isa? Usually when I ask Christians this question, a lot of them don't like to use the word Allah for God, but they like to use the word Isa for Jesus. And I'm like, well, why? Why do you say one and not the other? Let's take a look at what Isa implies. They believe that Isa was born of a virgin. Well, that's pretty good. That Isa was sinless. Wow, that's pretty good. He had miracles. He healed the sick. He raised the dead to life. That's all very positive. Coheres with what we understand about Jesus in the Bible. However, Isa never died. They believe he couldn't have died. That's just shameful to die. He's not the Son of God, and he's not one with God. In fact, Isa is second greatest prophet in the Quran after Muhammad. So he's not even the greatest. He's certainly not the Son of God. So again, we have to think, is Isa a an acceptable word to use for Jesus or not, right? And again, these are things you have to struggle with as missiologists. Systematic theologians don't worry about this sort of stuff. They just want to go in and say, yeah, just sweep away all their religions and let's just replace it all with what is the true God, right? But often what they're replacing it with is a Western concept of the true God. And I'm not saying that that is not the true God, but I'm saying that a lot of the Western culture comes with it. And so what makes you uncomfortable here? Is it culture? Is it false understandings? What is it? And I think we need to be discerning about this and what parts can be contextualized and what parts need to be done away with. Now, pagan Christianity. Do you know that in the West, we actually are the products of a lot of paganism, right? We baptize pagan things. And I think it's only appropriate because that's what God does to us. We are pagan people who have been baptized into Christ. God has taken us and made us new, but he has not wiped out what we were completely. He has not wiped out our identity, but he's taken the wrong things and corrected them, okay? And I think that's often what we do. Do you know that the word God, which we think, oh, that's a pure word for God? Well, not really. It comes from this Germanic word, Gott, which implies sort of a Scandinavian heritage. It's sort of akin to Thor or, the Scandinavian pantheon of gods, right? But we have no qualms about using this originally pagan word to talk about the Christian God. We've baptized it. What about in Greek? We say, well, certainly the word theos, which is the Greek word for God, is okay. Well, theos in Greek, or deus in Latin, comes from Zeus. Even that is a baptized pagan word. And yet we say that's okay. We can use this sort of baptized pagan word, right? So lest we think that, other cultures are tainted by their culture, but Western Christianity is pure. Not so, right? Let's go on. Do you know that our Christmas time, why do we pick December 25th? Nobody really knows when Jesus was born, but we picked it because it's right around the time of the winter solstice. This was a pagan festival. It celebrated Yule. So we burned the Yule log, and that's a Roman pagan festival, right? The whole 12 days of Christmas, eating ham, burning the Yule log, the 12 dark nights of the Nights of the Spirits. The winter solstice is chosen because this is a time of rebirth of the sun, and so we say, well, that's a good time to sort of overlay the birth of Christ, right? Mistletoe and winterberry were hung to appease the pagan spirits, right? They tried to worship the Norse god of fertility called Freyr. This is where we get Friday from. And they sacrificed the pig, which was Freyr's favorite animal. And that's why we feast on Christmas ham, right? Jeremiah 10 says we should not have Christmas trees. It says only the pagans go and get a tree from the forest and cut it down and put it in their homes and decorate it with silver and gold. And that's a pagan thing. Do not do that, right? And yet we do that, right? So all these things, these customs we have, are paganized, right? Or from pagan roots. How about Easter? This comes from the Babylonian fertility goddess Ishtar, right? And you can see the fertility symbols everywhere with bunnies and Easter eggs, right? This is around the time of the spring equinox when the Druids would all worship, right? And we can overlay that with Passover, certainly, but there's still a lot of pre-Christian pagan things that are in our culture. Platonic philosophy. Western Christianity is imbued with Platonic philosophy. If you talk to J.P. Moreland, who's probably Biola's most famous professor, he likes to say Plato was 70% Christian. Because if you read Plato, even though he had no access to the Bible, no access to Christianity, but he was 70% Christian. Somehow he had this spark of God in him, which made him get 70% of truth correct, right? Hold on just a few more minutes, okay, if you will. I'll be done in just maybe 2 or 3 minutes. But if Plato can be so close to God, and St. Augustine, the greatest theologian in the history of the church, outside of the Bible, he took Plato and used that for Western Christianity as the basis, right? Again, this pagan roots for our Christianity. And we've seen how Platonic philosophy has actually negatively affected some of our Western Christianity. For example, Plato said, the spirit is better than the body. And so what do? We say, well, when we do missions, let's do evangelism, but not social justice, right? Now, thankfully, that's changed a lot. But for a long time, people thought the body was inferior and the spirit is good. All you need to do is soul salvation. Again, that's a result of pagan Platonic philosophy. Okay? I recommend you read a book by Frank Viola and George Barna, who talked about the church building, the order of worship, the sermon, the pastor, baptism, and the Lord's Supper. A lot of these things actually come from culture and not from the Bible. Now, of course, baptism and the Lord's Supper were charged by Jesus to do, but really the roots of them were pagan. Even Jesus himself used pagan words. He would say, on this rock I will build this church, and the gates of Hades will not stand up against this. Did Jesus really believe in Hades, which is the Greek hell? No, but he used a Greek contextual word so that people would understand it, right? So I think before we say other cultures are infected or infused with their culture, but Western Christianity is pure, I think we need to think about, is that really true, right? And so, okay, I'm just going to stop there. But and just to think that baptizing pagan things is part of what, though there's a danger to that, it's also part of what makes Christianity so translatable to so many cultures around the world.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.